Dylan is supposed to mark it. We'll sit. I'll tell him.
Okay.
Hey everybody, can you hear me okay? All right, welcome to Peterborough Town Library for our February Natural New Hampshire program. We are so excited to welcome you. My name is Rebecca Edmond. I am the Program and Outreach Librarian here at the library. And I'm thrilled to welcome you tonight to our program on trail history and design. Before we get started, it's very important that I acknowledge that this program would not have happened without the work of Dewey and Mary Clark. Thank them both so much for all the work that they've done to coordinate and produce the Natural New Hampshire series. We're so thankful to them and their commitment to bringing these programs to New Hampshire, or to the Peterborough Town Library and to the wider community. It's been a joy working with both of you. Thank you so much. All right, so a couple little housekeeping notes. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available on YouTube, on the library's YouTube channel, so stay tuned for that, potentially, if there's no issues. Secondly, we would love to get your feedback about what kinds of environmental and conservation topics you would like to see in 2026. So we've set up a whiteboard in the back. So if you could take a few minutes at the end of this program to write down some topics that you would like to see at future programs, we would really appreciate it. If your topic is already up there, just put like a hashtag next to it so we know that you like it. And lastly, I'll just say that we hope that we'll see you at our next Natural New Hampshire program on March 27th. Forest Society educator, naturalist, and writer Dave Anderson is going to be sharing some humorous stories, lore, and some science about backyard maple sugaring. And there's also going to be a maple syrup testing and pancake tasting. So we hope to see you all then. All right, so with that, I will hand the mic over to Stephen Roberge, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you so much.
Great, wow, what a crowd. Thank you, Rebecca, for the introduction. And my name is Steve Roberge. I'm the State Extension Forester for UNH Cooperative Extension. And if you don't know Extension, we are a group of people that have educators throughout the whole state, including county foresters that can talk about all things environmental. We have a woodlot, we can walk your property, and we can put on and help put on events like this. And so we actually have a robust website with a bunch of different events and newsletters. So if you go to nhwoods.org, you can tap into things like tonight or other programs, or actually reach out to your local county forester. Very excited to hear what Dylan has to say tonight, and just really the history of trails and how to kind of use trails moving forward. Dylan Summers grew up in New Hampshire, and his childhood developed a deep love for nature and understanding of the importance of connecting with it. This led him to a career in building and maintaining trails that facilitate that core connection. He has built and maintained trails professionally in New Hampshire, Utah, and Colorado, and now works for the Society for Protection of the New Hampshire Forest, managing trail maintenance and recreation infrastructure projects across the 200+ properties owned by the Forest Society. When not on trail, and with tools in hand, can be found both on and off trail, on foot and skis. That's my type of pastime now. Exploring the landscape of the Northeast. So Dylan's got a really tight presentation here, and I ask that if you have questions, just try to remember them to the end. We'll have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. I do have a microphone that I'll kind of move through the audience, just so Dylan doesn't have to repeat your question, so that you all can hear the question as well. So when Dylan's done, we'll just open up to questions from there. And like I said, like Rebecca said, again, the whiteboard in the back, please write down your ideas. And looking forward to seeing you not only afterwards and have a chat, but also next month, the 27th, to talk about making sugar too. So with that, Dylan, thank you.
Mic is not working? Oh, that's good. Hold on. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. Welcome, everybody, and good evening. My name is Dylan Summers, and I work for the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests. And I'm excited to be here tonight to talk to you about my little corner of the conservation world, which is recreational trails. A little bit more about myself and the work I do. I fell in love with nature and hiking as a teenager, and I fell hard. And after graduating college, I went into the mountains for a summer doing trail work, thinking that it would be a thing I would do for a summer or two before graduate school or another career, and I didn't end up ever leaving. So that's brought me here. I worked seasonally for nearly a decade as a trail worker for nonprofits, for the U.S. Forest Service and private companies, and then finally made my way to the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests, or the Forest Society. So the Forest Society, if you aren't familiar with it, is a statewide nonprofit land trust. We started back in 1901 at the beginning of conservation, really, in the United States, of the Wiltop. And we began, our mission includes protecting and conserving land, sustainable forestry, political advocacy, education, and my realm, which is recreation. In the Monadnock region, we started conserving land on Mount Monadnock in 1915, and over the years have now have 200 properties across the state, and along with countless conservation easements. I was supposed to bring a bunch of material, magazines, and things like that tonight. I forgot. I can see our Vice President of Development in the audience is like, oh, but hopefully. This is why you should all show up to Dave Anderson's talk in March about Forest Notes magazines. So on behalf of the Forest Society, thank you for being here tonight. Let's get into it. So there are many things in our lives we take for granted, and the trails we walk on when we go to the woods is often one of those things. Everyone has walked on a trail, but a lot of folks don't think very much about how it got there. And people kind of understand that a trail is something man-made, but think very little about what goes into that, and often think of it as something natural, almost spontaneous. But the trails that we hike when we go to the mountains didn't appear spontaneously. They're the result of very human choices and the consequences, intended and unintended, of those choices. Anyone who has hiked in New England knows that our trails are steep, rocky, and challenging. But not a lot of people who haven't worked on them aren't always aware of how maddeningly difficult it is to maintain those trails. So given the long history of hiking in this part of the country, we're going to go back some 200 years and talk about the history of trail building to understand how our trails ended up like they are, what went wrong along the way, and what trail workers today are doing to design trails better. Along the way, we will gain insight into the beliefs that motivated those who built these early trails, and how trails were intricately linked to the early economies of tourism in New Hampshire. Now, it took several hundred years of living here for European colonists to build any real recreational hiking trails. The early colonists mostly regarded the natural world as something hostile, something to struggle against and survive. Those few who did venture into the howling wilderness, early surveyors, scientists, foresters, and the occasional curious adventurer, pretty much all did so without trails. It wasn't until the beginning of the 19th century that more than a handful of people began going into the mountains for their own purposes. The Industrial Revolution was underway in America, and the radical changes it brought in society began to change how people viewed the natural world. With poverty, dirtiness, overcrowding of the early industrial cities, that howling wilderness to the early settlers started to look a lot more like a refuge. So this was the century that birthed Transcendentalism, which was a philosophical and literary movement with writers like Emerson and Thoreau and Muir. And it romanticized nature and wilderness as a site of beauty, divinity, and refuge from the ills of modern society specifically. And the influence of their thoughts should not be understated. I took a nature writing course in college, and my professor would always say that all nature writing and conservation writing of the 20th century could basically be traced back in time, either influenced by or in response to Thoreau, specifically Thoreau. And the Transcendentalists set up a dichotomy between this idea of untouched, unspoiled nature versus the folly of human society. And it was an inverse of the early settlers' view of the world. But it still left intact that dichotomy between humans and natures. And as we'll see, these beliefs would be highly influential in how people would go about beginning to explore the mountains and making trails. Now, this painting is by the Hudson River School painter Thomas Cole, and he depicts Crawford Notch, named after the innkeeping family which settled the remote mountain pass and provided lodging to travelers along what was becoming a major east-west thoroughfare for commerce from coastal cities like Portland into the interior of early America. And it would also become what is considered sort of the first center for tourism in the mountains of the Northeast. By the early 1800s, the Crawfords were already starting to guide the occasional curious adventure seeker and bushwhacking to the summit of nearby Mount Washington, the highest point in the state. And in 1819, the family cut the Crawford Path, which is considered the oldest still existing recreational trail in the United States. That trail was built as a business opportunity for the Crawfords, and allowing them to guide adventurous guests right from their door to the summit of Mount Washington. And the rough trail would eventually be cleared and improved into a bridle path. And by the mid-19th century, the Crawfords were pretty much spending most of their summer hosting and guiding hikers who wanted to reach the highest summit in the Northeast. Around the same time, in the early 1820s, a little closer to here, the first trails of Monadnock began to be established. With its summit cleared by fires near the turn of the century and located further south in more densely populated regions, it didn't take long for Monadnock to become a popular day trip for nearby communities. By 1826, several entrepreneurial locals had built shanties on the mountain to provide refreshments and occasionally lodging to early hikers along the trail, including alcohol. The Dublin Trail, the north side, the Dublin Trail and Marlborough Trails, some sources suggest they already existed at this time, making them the oldest still existing trails in the mountain. But an interesting story is that the Dublin Trail, up the north side of the mountain, was improved in 1843 so that they could haul empty tar barrels to build a bonfire on the summit, which was supposed to be seen from Boston during the commencement ceremony for the monument on Bunker Hill. There's no record of whether this pyrotechnic display succeeded or not. So it wouldn't be until the second half of the 19th century, after the end of the Civil War, that hiking really grew in popularity as a recreational pursuit in the Northeast. And this post-war was a new era of tourism, the era of the Grand Hotel. They were accessible to both wealthy and upper middle class urban tourists, and it was largely, as a model for tourism, it was largely based on the railway as the fastest method of transit for the time. And with the advent of tourism in the mountains, small and remote communities that were within a half-day carriage ride and railway hubs became transformed by the arrival of tourism. And due to the relative slowness of the transport, guests would often stay for weeks, months, and even whole summers at these resort hotels. In the White Mountain communities like Waterville Valley, Wannalancet, Brenton Woods, Borough, Jackson, Bethlehem, Franconia, and Randolph all became popular summer destinations, boasting many beautiful grand hotels and providing escape for city's dwellers. Monadnock itself hosted 3 hotels: the Halfway House, the Ark, and the Shadow. While this model of tourism wouldn't survive the arrival of the automobile and the road trip, it flourished during the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And as these resort communities flourished, networks of trails sprang up to accommodate the desires of the guests to explore the hills around them, leading to a surge in trail building during this time period. You look at trail maps, you can see these. You can often tell where hotels used to be by a tight spiderweb network of trails centered around their location. This historic map of Mount Monadnock, you can see over here on the left where the Halfway House is located. And if you see on the modern map of Mount Monadnock, a lot of those same trails that were built around that hotel still exist today. And there are a lot of trails up there. Now, these early trails that were created in the infancy of hiking's popularity still form the foundations of the hiking networks we use today. And if there's one thing that informed their construction more than any other thing, it was that they were usually labors of love. And by that I mean the labors of amateurs. Even when the trails were made at the behest of entrepreneurial hotel owners, such as the path that Crawfords built for themselves up Mount Washington, or the trail networks developed by Nathaniel Greeley in Waterville, or Catherine Sleeper in Wannalancet. The folks going out and building them were usually the enthusiastic hikers themselves. At hotels like the Ravine House in Randolph and the Halfway House in Monadnock, it was pretty much a pastime in and of itself for the guests to go out and build trails. And they would build trails all over the place to all of their favorite nooks and crannies on the mountainside. In 1876, a group from the upper class and academic set at Boston Society formed the Appalachian Mountain Club, which quickly became the organization for hiking enthusiasts. The early AMC was an all-volunteer run organization, and in its hierarchy of club leadership was a counselor of improvements who would coordinate the club's trail building activities. Now, early trail building itself mostly consisted of clearing a path through the woods. Axes, saws, and machetes were the primary tools employed. For us modern trail workers, we often think of a trail as composed of 2 things. The first is the corridor, and that's the space around the hiker that's cleared of vegetation so they have room to hike. That's what these early trail builders were doing. The second part of the trail is the tread, and that's the ground that the hiker hikes on. But that wasn't very important to these early trail builders. They were mostly just cutting trail corridors and left the ground as it was. Now, this was highly influenced by the ideas of the transcendentalists that we were talking about earlier. This idea of untouched nature, unspoiled nature is very clear. And by leaving the ground untouched, they felt that they were leaving the trail in as so-called as natural a state as possible. The builders of the trails were also seeking challenge and adventure. So they built trails that were rough and steep, and sometimes barely an improvement over the bushwhacking they had been doing before. The idea that anyone but tough, rugged outdoors people like themselves would want to even go into the mountains didn't really occur to them. One of the big benefits of this for them is it made trail building much easier, as clearing a corridor is less than half of what goes into building a modern hiking trail. But maintenance likewise consisted mostly of keeping the trail corridor clear of brush and fallen trees. It was, however, the routes for these early trails that became the real problem. The locations for these trails were primarily chosen for expediency, challenge, and the sense of naturalness. And it led to the characteristic straight up the mountain trail that hiking in the Northeast is notorious for. Now, trail builders refer to those as fall line trails, meaning that if you were to drop a ball on the trail, it would fall or roll straight downhill along the trail. And we'll talk about the long-term impacts of that soon. So before we move on, I want to do a little activity. We're going to do a historic safety check. Safety is important for trail work. It can be a dangerous job. So we're going to do a safety check. I want you guys to grade the safety of these early trailers. So shout out to A through F. Shout out to the grades for them. How do you think they're doing? D minus? Yep. I think I'm giving them an F. They've got boots on. That's about the most safety they're doing. But standing on a log while another person's also standing on and chopping that log, I don't even need to go into why that's a recipe for disaster. So, if there was one exception to the rule of early trail building, it was the trails built by John Rayner Edmonds, who was a very little known figure, pretty much outside of anywhere but the small niche of trail workers today. I would argue that Edmonds was the first person to really design trails in the Northeast. And what's interesting is trails would become the site of a debate between early trail builders about what a trail should look like. Edmonds began building trails in the northern presidential range in the late 19th century, from where he spent his summers at the Ravine House, with him pictured here on the porch. During this time, trail building was occurring against the backdrop of a larger conservation battle, which was the fight against exploitative and destructive logging in the White Mountains, in an industry dominated by monopolistic logger barons who were devastating the forest for a quick buck. Edmonds was a conservationist, and he was trying to grow interest in stopping destructive logging by getting people into the mountains. And his way of doing that was with trails that were easier to hike on, and that anyone could hike on. It's also been speculated that Edmonds was motivated to create easier to hike on trails by his late wife, who was disabled by chronic illness and died in 1888, right before he began building trails. Now, Edmonds, who had a degree in civil engineering as part of one of MIT's first graduating classes, was inspired by a trip he took to Colorado in 1888, shortly after his wife's death. Now, he was thoroughly impressed by the graded switchback paths that the miners and other people of Colorado had built to get them and their pack animals high into the Rockies. And he was so inspired that he decided to begin experimenting with the same trail building techniques back in New Hampshire. He spent his summers at the Ravine House in Randolph and began designing trails in that area, and later on the west side of Mount Washington near the Mount Washington Hotel. The engineer would meticulously lay miles of string through the woods to mark the location of his proposed intended path, and then hired and supervised crews of local workers in building his trails. His paths climbed the mountains by contouring at moderate grades instead of going straight uphill. And above tree line, he would rearrange the jumbled rocks of the presidential range into smooth paths and build cairns to mark the way so that hikers wouldn't get lost in fog. Now, when the logging did arrive to the northern presidentials, destroying some of the trails he was attempting to build, he would move his summer residence to the Mount Washington Hotel. And the hotel owners saw the business opportunity to well-built trails for their well-heeled clientele. And the hotel had the Italian craftsmen who they had brought to America to build their hotel, also build the trails that Edmonds was working on and designed up until Edmonds' untimely death of a stroke at age 60 in 1921. Now, Edmonds was a man ahead of his time. Although we don't know all of his motivations for how he built trails, the way he built them follows many of the same principles we follow in modern trail design. But the sort of trail he built was at the center of a fierce debate about what trails should look like amongst the early trail building community. And many of his contemporaries derided his work, feeling that easy-to-walk-on paths, graded paths were detrimental to the sense of adventure, wildness, and untouched nature that they were seeking in the mountains. Edmonds trails were described as, quote, boulevards, on which walkers streamed up the mountain like a transplanted tea party. Edmonds trails also required a great deal more effort to build, and he paid workers, while those who were making other trails on a volunteer basis preferred to make more miles of trail with less effort. In the AMC's annual report on trail building in 1900, they made pointed jabs at Edmonds' work, praising the trails they built that year as left as far as possible in its natural state, but with plenty of blazes to mark the way and bushes cleared which impede progress. And in no case has the club undertaken to make the smooth graded paths or so-called boulevards. Such work is left to others who have more time and means at their disposal than the club can afford. So Warren Hart, who was the AMC's Counselor of Improvements in 1909, and is famous for making the extremely steep scrambling trails in the Great Gulf Wilderness, had even harsher words for Edmonds trails, referring to them as highly superfluous boulevards of piled stonework that a perverted energy has built here and there upon the mountain. Perverted energy. So, although they were grudgingly impressed by the dedication and mastery involved in building trails like these, almost no one else who was building trails at the time cared to imitate Edmonds. So whether they were ignorant in how to design trails well, maybe, focused on creating a more natural and challenging experience, couldn't muster the workforce, or were simply grumpy New Englanders who didn't like change, folks in the Northeast continued to build straight up the mountain fault line trails. And for a time that worked. Hiking was still a relatively niche interest. For the guests at these grand hotels, hiking was one of many other leisure pursuits available to them. But hiking would not remain a niche interest forever. Now, the flurry of trail building continued into the early 20th century before it finally began to slow. With the establishment of the National Forest and the end of destructive logging, trails began reaching beyond the hotels and into more remote and wild parts of the mountains. The last major spurt of trail building in the state was done in a more professional and sometimes more sustainable manner by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. The CCC built many ski trails, camping shelters, and other trails and facilities during that time in the White Mountains, and in state parks across the state, such as Bear Brook, Moose Brook, and Monadnock. On their more developed trails and facilities, their work often featured fine stonemasonry and woodwork. So we're going to do another historical safety check here. I can see the crowd getting ready for it. So, all right, A to F. What do you think about these, gents? Yes. So I give them like a C minus, because they've got safety glasses on. They even have respirators on, which is safe when working with power tools on stone. But where are their helmets? And their shirts. Yeah, exactly. No one wore shirts back then. So by this time of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the trail network in the White Mountains had become huge. And now the struggle was to keep the existing trail maintained. The ANC began to hire college students in the summer of 1919 to maintain trails in the White Mountains, and it was still a daunting task. In this photo of the AMC's 1924 trail crew, you can see their tools: axes, crosscut saws, loppers, machetes, and scythes. They're all tools for clearing overgrown vegetation or removing down trees from the trail. So as it had been for the first 100 years of trail work, With the exceptions of admin's work, for the most part, trail building and maintenance was mostly of clearing a path through the woods, not touching the ground that was walked on. The hurricane of 1938 was a major event at the time, which caused devastation across New England, with high winds blowing down so many trees that many trails were entirely abandoned due to how much work it would have been to bring them back, or their original roots being lost amongst a sea of fallen trees. Now, interest in hiking and outdoor recreation had been on the increase through the first half of the 20th century, but the 1960s and 1970s changed everything. The automobile and the road trip had replaced the Grand Hotel as the iconic American vacation, and it also made the mountains accessible to many, many more people, with weekend trips to New Hampshire within easy reach of major cities in the Northeast. Combine that with the post-war baby boom. Yeah, I'm sorry to blame baby boom. Millennial baby boomers on that for bad trails. I can see the headlines now. The baby boom, the back to the land movement of hippie culture in the 60s and 70s, and combine that with new technology, including lightweight aluminum frame packs and lightweight fabric, and tens of thousands of more people were coming into the mountains, specifically to hike into the wilderness, and particularly backcountry camping exploded, and thus the so-called backpacking boom was born. Now, the surge of popularity in hiking caused immediate problems. Overcrowding and impacts on trails, but that's mixed up here. Sorry, my notes got out of order. Excuse me. Overcrowding at trails and campsites were a problem from the get-go. Trash, in particular, began to overflow the wilderness. It was common at the time for campers to partially burn or toss refuse into trash dumps in the woods. Campsites became denuded as campers burnt any available wood, and sensitive ecosystems such as alpine plant communities were decimated by the feet of careless hikers. All these impacts spawned the Leave No Trace movement and our modern ethic of low-impact outdoor recreation, which is wonderful. But while all this was happening, another problem had been quietly emerging over the course of decades, one that couldn't readily be solved by individual action. And that is, of course, the problem of trail erosion. Now, the forest floor is pretty resilient to erosion, thanks to the roots of trees, smaller plants, and organic materials such as fallen logs and leaf litter. But the surface of a hiking trail is not. Each footfall on a hiking trail dislodges a tiny little bit of soil, which then becomes available for water to wash away. But if 5 or 20 people were to walk over a section of trail in a year, it's unlikely you'd see very much significant impact. But 100 to 200 people, in a decade, you might start seeing some considerable impacts. But what if about 1,000 people, or 10,000 people, or 100,000 people? The fall-line nature of trails built by those early adventure-seeking trail builders now came back to haunt the trail maintainers in the present. During heavy rains, water would flow hard and fast, straight down fall-line trails, carrying away soil that had been disturbed by the boots of hikers. This made the trails into gullies, like you see here, exacerbating the problem by concentrating more water and causing faster erosion. And so steep fall-line trails that had been built a century ago, already worn from decades of use, started to degrade quickly under the strains of levels of use they were never designed to handle. On rainy days, like this one I took a photo of over here on the left, I've heard many folks unfamiliar with trail maintenance complain, why did they put a trail in the stream? But we know that the trail became a stream. On flatter trails, where water doesn't readily drain, huge mud pits started to become a problem as hikers would churn up the soil and the water would saturate it. And as the mud became deeper, hikers began to skirt around the edges, making them muddier and muddier and expanding the impacted area to 10 to 20 feet wide. Now, these photos of the White Dot Trail in 1943, even decades before the backpacking boom, are already showing significant levels of erosion. You can see in the top photo these exposed roots that are all around. In this bottom photo, you can see that the trail has already become a rocky gully as water has washed away the soil covering the rocks, and it's now a treacherous, rocky path to hike up. This is the White Dot Trail 80 years later in 2023. And it's now, in many places, about 20 feet wide. And as hikers have avoided eroded sections of trail, they create new erosion problems. And as a popular trail has two-way traffic, people have to pass each other and widen the trail to where you see here is about 10 to 20 feet wide in this location. This is the Tuckerman Ravine Trail, shortly after being built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1931. This is the Tuckerman Ravine Trail 35 years later, in 1966. And you can already see that there were significant erosion impacts to the trail. In this photo over here on the left, you can see that it's already below the grade of the existing ground. And in these other two photos on the right, there are rocks everywhere. And this is the Tuckerman Ravine Trail today. So with all these new problems cropping up, trail maintainers were forced to find new solutions. No longer did trail crews mostly just keep trails clear of vegetation. They were soon spending most of their season trying to control the growing erosion problems. Attempting to repair and protect fall-line trails became the primary problem of trail maintenance across the region. And the solution was adding better drainage, so get water off the trail, and hardening the trail surface to resist erosion. The water bar, this structure here over on the left, is designed to channel water off trail so that it removes the water and slows it down to stop erosion. The staircase over here on the right is designed to stabilize eroding slopes. Both of these became ubiquitous structures on steep fall-line trails across the Northeast. Bog bridges and stepping stones were also added to get hikers across muddy areas. Tools of a stonemason have been added to the tools of a logger in the repertoire of trail workers. But it still hasn't been enough. Part of the problem is the issue of scale. There simply haven't been enough resources or enough trail workers to fix all the erosion problems on such an extensive trail network. The other part of the issue is the inherent flaw of a fall-line trail. If a trail goes up straight uphill, water will always run straight down it, and erosion will forever be a challenge. Drainages and staircases are band-aids on this bigger problem. Staircases are often built to patch erosion in localized locations. But over time, once the trail below the staircase erodes, as you can see in this photo of wooden check steps on the Dublin Trail on the Monadnock, then it can compromise whole staircases. And in the long term, a structure like that only survives if it's built to protect the whole slope, which on some trails would mean miles of staircase built from top to bottom. Drainages are great for getting water off the trail, but they fill with sediments constantly, and they require constant maintenance. And you can see this water bar hasn't been maintained in a long time. It is full of sediment, and water is washing over it. And you can see erosion problems just downhill that the water bar is supposed to be protecting that trail, but if it's full of dirt, it's not doing its job. And they only function with frequent maintenance, and when the maintenance burden on the vast trail network is already so big, this is a considerable problem. So the problems of flawed design and inadequate solutions becoming more apparent, trail builders of the present had to look for new solutions. And the first step of that has been learning how to build trails that won't suffer from the same problems as trails in the past. Enter the side hill or bench cut trail. Now, this trail design isn't new by any means. Indeed, many of the best practices of how we build trails can be traced back to ancient civilizations like the Romans and the Incas, who built vast transportation networks without mechanized equipment, and the Incas through extraordinarily mountainous terrain. These were also the same sort of trails that Edmonds had been so impressed by when he visited Colorado in 1888. Most of the trails in the Mountain West were built first as transportation infrastructure for horses, and they needed to climb at gentle grades to allow trains of pack animals to navigate them. And so builders cut trails into the hillside, climbing at moderate grades, and then built switchbacks, which anyone who hiked out west is probably familiar with, which are hard V-shaped turns that send the trail back across the mountainside when a gradually climbing trail reaches an impasse in the terrain. But what is good for horses turns out also to be pretty good at preventing erosion. Before we go any further, though, we have another historic safety check over here. 1953, workers in Washington building the Side Hill Trail. How are they doing? Pretty good. He's got his hard hat on. Yeah. So we find out that in the history of safety protocols, hard hats advented in 1953. So the beauty of a Side Hill Trail lies in its elegant simplicity and yet extraordinarily effective design. As we talked about before, steep trails are oriented up the fall line and are extremely prone to erosion. The brilliance of a Side Hill Trail is less in being less steep than a fall line trail, though that is a factor, and more in its relationship to the slope it crosses. As we know, with the fall line trail, water runs straight downhill and gathers more and more water as it goes. Even a fall line trail up a gentle hill will suffer that same problem. On a Side Hill Trail, water flows across the trail. Its momentum from coming down the slope above it, carrying it off of the trail before it has a chance to cause major erosion problems. Even in areas where some of the water does run downhill, a simple and short change in the trail from traveling uphill to downhill to back uphill, what us trail builders call the grade reversal, is enough to get water to channel off of the trail at its lowest point. And it's a drainage structure that requires basically no maintenance, unlike our water bars of old. Now, scientific research backs this up, and research on trail erosion has given us guidelines for how to design trails like these, with studies showing that trails that ascend at a grade less than half as steep as the grade of the slope they're built on are much less prone to erosion. On this chart on the right, the column on the far right is steep, super steep. The column on left is not so steep. The row at the top is fall line trails, and the row at the bottom is trails that are built at a very gentle climbing side hill. So, as we repair old trails and build new ones, we look to these guidance for how to build trails that will be sustainable long into the future. Now, we still face a lot of major hurdles to repairing our trail system. Relocating problem sections of trails to new sustainably built sections, not too far, is the best solution for long-term problems. But relocating trails is a major endeavor. This is not just cutting a corridor through the woods. There's a lot of excavating involved. And with scarce resources and labor, continuing to patch up old trails is often easier in the short term. Hikers who have been using the same trails for decades also don't like change. We talked about stubborn New Englanders earlier. And they prefer to keep their rocky, steep gullies, thank you very much. So as a result, trail managers today use both old and new methods for repairing and maintaining trails. The staircases and water bars of old, and the side hill relocations of the present. New trails, when we build them, we try to get right the first time. New innovations in trail construction technology have also improved things. We found that on extremely high-use trails, imported surface of crushed stone is often more resistant to erosion than native soils. And we've also found that machinery, like compact excavators, can be used effectively to build trails faster and with less human effort. Now, anyone familiar with the Forest Society probably heard about our large trail relocation project at Mount Major this past summer. Mount Major is one of the most popular hikes in the state, with our trail counters counting around 80,000 people who hike up Mount Major every year from the main parking lot. Now, if you consider that half of them come down the same way they go up, it's not an exaggeration to say that the main trail sees over 100,000 sets of footfalls every year. Now, over the decades, that high level of use combined with highly erodible soils in the area had caused major damage to the trail. In particular, the lower section of the trail was significantly dulled, including this nightmare gully you see here, which we call the canyon. All of that eroded soil was washing downstream and straight into Lake Winnipesaukee, causing major siltation problems. Now, this past summer, the Forest Society undertook a major trail relocation project, hiring professional trail builders, Town 4 Trail Services, and OBP Trail Works to do the work. And build an entirely new relocated trail for the bottom section. Now, for many people, this trail looks overbuilt. Just like the old AMC Guard rallying against Edmonds' so-called boulevards at the turn of the 19th century, folks certainly expressed to us that they were upset that we were doing so much intense work on the trail. But context is of utmost importance to good design. And if you consider the 80,000 people who use this trail every year, this design is entirely appropriate. For one, the trail needs to be wide enough to accommodate two-way traffic on busy summer days. If it's not, hikers will step off the trail to pass each other, causing erosion problems up and downhill from the trail. This crushed stone surface, as we talked about earlier, is particularly erosion resistant, far more resistant than the native soils on the site. And then the trail is laid out to climb gradually with good drainage. And where it needed to be more steep, stone staircases were built before erosion problems occurred, protecting the whole slope to prevent any erosion issues from cropping up. Not all trails need to or should look like this, but trails should be built to be appropriate for the amount of use they get. Part of the beauty of good trail design, in my opinion, is that lower levels of use trails that are less used, they can be built to blend in and look almost as natural as the paths that early trail builders were making. Trail designers and builders think very carefully about how we blend our work with the environment around it and make it as unobtrusive as possible, focusing the hikers on the experience of nature rather than about what they are walking on. In the modern context of trails, I think most hikers end up thinking more about the trail when they are cursing how steep, rocky, and wet it is than when they're hiking over a subtle and sustainably built trail. To not repeat the problems of the past, our trail builders of today need to be looking to how their trails are being used by people hundreds of years in the future. Accessibility to those with varying disabilities, whether in wheelchairs, conditions that affect coordination and balance, or simply old age, is becoming more of a consideration for trail managers and designers. And the good news is that a sustainably built trail will always be more accessible than our eroded and rocky ones. Climate change, of course, has put our trail infrastructure under more and more strain, and making trails designed to withstand unpredictable weather, including extremely heavy rains, is becoming all the more important. The place of trails in wider economies is also starting to be finally given its due. As the history I shared shows, trails and tourism go hand in hand, and the trail, which is the core infrastructure of nearly all terrestrial outdoor sports, is the base of nearly every outdoor tourism economy in this region, and is starting to be finally recognized as such. And however, long, long way to go. There are some who are beginning to recognize that those who build, design, and maintain trails have critical careers to this tourism economy and deserve living wages and sustainable professional career paths for the difficult work they do. We live in a time, both in the mountains and in the wider world, in which we can no longer really afford the romantic notions of unspoiled, separate nature that characterize the philosophies of the Transcendentalists. In his 1995 essay, The Trouble with Wilderness, William Cronin writes that when we reproduce the dualism that sets humanity and nature at opposite poles, we leave ourselves little hope of discovering what an ethical, sustainable, honorable human place in nature might actually look like. Humans have always shaped the world around them, and if we are to do so in ways that are sustainable, we must accept that the reality of our presence rather than flee from it, and make conscious choices to integrate our lives with ecosystems that we are an essential part of, not separate from. Modern trail design, which seeks to utilize appropriate technology, design for the long term, equity of access, and an emphasis on subtly integrating a beautifully crafted trail within the broader landscape, is a small part of the solution, but can provide useful insights into how we can design our world for a more sustainable future. The challenges of our time are daunting both on and off the trail, but the solutions for those things are within reach if you're collectively bold enough to take them. Thank you for listening. All right, I'm sure folks have questions, so.
Yes, and if you have questions, I have a mic, so just raise your hand and we'll get to you.
So a lot of the trails in the whites are just slamming up and down jetties. Do you figure that's stasis at that point? You don't have to do anything anymore? Because, I mean, I'm never going to move a 500-pound boulder, boulder after boulder after boulder for a mile.
It really depends on the trail, honestly. Some trails that are eroded down to bedrock, they're not going to erode anymore. But even those trails there were problems with that. First of all, they're hazardous. If anyone's hiked on some highly eroded slab of rock, if it's wet out, you're on a slip and slide. So there are reasons to build sustainable trails beyond just this is not going to get any worse. But even a lot of the trails that you think are rocky messes that aren't going to get any worse, they still have the potential to get worse than they are. As the trail at Mount Major, I think, really illustrates things can get really bad. This case was particularly erodible soils combined with really high use. That's not happening everywhere. But things will get worse over time. Who else got questions?
There's another spot just like that, but actually probably worse, going up Cannon Mountain.
That one's notorious, yes.
Sand, and it's just, Kinsman's, it's just like,
Yeah. That particular spot, I'm aware of it. I've hiked that section. It's kind of miserable. I do not know if the Forest Service has plans to ever repair that mountain. I mean, the Forest Service has limited resources, as we all know. And it's probably not a very high priority. It's not a super high use trail. This trail at Mount Major, we needed to fix. It was bad, and because of the high use it gets, it really deserved the work done.
Hey, is there any times when you've had to be involved in projects of actually closing trails because of overuse, and is there a process for that?
When you say closing trails, do you mean closing them like no one ever hikes here again? I have never, that does happen. Usually when a trail is really unsustainably built and there's other trails that can kind of take the going to the same places as it. But most of the time we spend building a trail to replace. So relocating that trail to a new location and a sustainable design. People don't like their trails to disappear. People hate that. they have a hard enough time when we like moving. But I think one of the beautiful things about hiking is how attached people become to the special places for them. And I swear every gosh dang trail has someone who's like, that is my favorite trail. I love that rocky, eroded thing. So I think trail managers try to be conscious of that and recognize that, like, you know, the trail's there for a reason because people are connected to that place, and we need to provide a way for them to connect to that place. So, yeah, thank you.
So a lot of what you talked about today so far has been below tree line, as far as I can tell.
Mm-hmm.
How do you change your philosophy when you go into the alpine zone above tree line?
That's a really good question. The alpine zone above tree line can vary a lot, and it varies a lot depending on location. I think we are probably already obviously talking about New Hampshire, but if you go to the Rockies or other parts of the country, they have very different soils, very different. Above tree line looks very different than it does here. Our trails above tree line are as we saw in this photo. Going back, sorry, we have to go back a ways to get to this one. But we saw in the photo of Edmonds Trail above tree line, you know, it's pretty much the tallest slope on Mount Washington. And that's the case in a lot of places in the presidential range in particular. And so maybe we're getting to a point where, yeah, the trails aren't eroding very much, but the erosion problems above tree line are really, really problems of the alpine plant communities. And that's where the real danger lies for them. During the backpacking boom, there was a major push to protect those things because of how quickly alpine plant communities were being destroyed as tons more people flooded the mountains. It's been fairly successful. We've managed to, in a lot of cases, protect dying and disappearing alpine plant communities. That doesn't mean it's not still a problem, it certainly is. And we try to manage that with a variety of strategies, education being a huge one. Please stay on the trail or rock hop if you're leaving the trail. Keeping the hiker on the trail, the biggest challenge above tree line is that because you don't have a bunch of trees forming walls around you, it can be very easy to start wandering off in a random direction over some rocks. I know I worked for the soccer district in the White Mountains on Mount Shikorwa. That is a particularly notorious place for keeping people on trail. Monadnock has the same problems. There's no cairns to build rocks out of. You gotta get people to look at paint on the rock, and people never do that. So there are particular challenges about tree line. You know, scree walls was for years we need to build walls, little low walls along the edge of every alpine trail. That has had success. They also don't last. They get kicked, they get pushed, they get moved. So there are definite challenges for above tree line and unique challenges compared to below tree line trails.
What is your favorite trail in New Hampshire?
Oh, that's a hard question.
And what trails do you suggest?
That's a hard question. I don't know if I would choose a favorite trail. You're also asking, is it my favorite trail or my favorite place a trail takes me? Those are two different answers, I think. If you want to see some interesting trail work, one trail I hiked last summer was the Trail of Mount Tecumseh in Waterville Valley. I was impressed because the whole thing is a staircase. Remember how I was talking about what a sustainable staircases looks like is miles of staircase up the whole mountain? That's kind of what that trail, not the lower section so much, but the upper section looks like. And I was impressed with the dedication and the amount of work that was put into that trail. So if you want to see some good, interesting staircases, that trail, the trail at Blueberry Ledge, going up Whiteface is also beautiful stonework on that. But Yeah, those are two beautiful places where you can see some interesting trail work.
So I was just taking for granted that I'm walking on all the beautiful trails in New Hampshire. You know, you're a trail right. What other agencies, who employs all the trail rights? How many of them are there? Is it Society of Prevention in New Hampshire Forest, the Feds? Who?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a variety of organizations doing trail work and employing people doing trail work. I'd say one of the major things about New Hampshire is that a lot of the trails work is done by volunteers. The Forest Society and the Appalachian Mountain Club both get a lot of people to volunteer their time to help us maintain our trails. And the truth is that with the challenges of trail work as a career path, we need more help than we've got. I could have gone in many different directions with this talk tonight. And I could have, one of the things I thought about focusing on was the stories about the people who build the trails. We are a very strange group of people, I'll tell you that much. We don't like the limelight, honestly. We kind of like to stay in the background doing our thing. But it's a difficult career. It's low pay, it's seasonal until you get into management. It is, and the people who do it because they are extraordinarily passionate about what they do. And I don't want to get too political, but we are in a time where funding for trails, particularly at the federal level, is being slashed at an unprecedented rate. And I would emphasize the human stories in that, where people who have dedicated their lives to extraordinarily difficult jobs, because trail work is punishing on your body, punishing mentally out in the elements every day for months on end. People who are extraordinarily passionate about this as a career chose it because they love it. And no one is in this for the money, that's for sure. Are starting to lose their jobs as funding is slashed in all sorts of things. And this is not even a current problem. It's been a growing problem over decades of policy changes and different priorities. And our trails have suffered because of it. And the folks who do them lead for better and more sustainable careers. And so I love trails. I love the people who build them. And I want to see us value that and give it its due. Making it more accessible to them and engaging them and educating them about what the trails need. Because a lot of folks, so many folks, they love hiking. They do it all the time, it's their passion, but they don't know what goes on and what goes into a trail. They don't know what it means. And so being able to communicate that and say, hey, we need help. The trails you love need help is an important part of that, for sure. I had another thought, but I can't remember what it was.
Feed them. Give them food.
Yeah. Give them food, yes.
What about liability on private ownership trails?
Yeah, that's an interesting case. There's a lot of complex relationships that happen when a private landowner opens their trail to public opens their land to public access. There are a lot of trails that aren't explicitly open to the public that can be used anyways. And it usually is all kosher until there's a problem. And then all of a sudden the landowner is like, boom, no more. One of the biggest places you see this isn't actually in hiking, but is in rock climbing. Is a lot of cases of people using privately owned land, cliffs that are privately owned to rock climb, and then there's usually it's bad behavior, trash, things like that. And the landowner's like, I don't want to see this on my land, we're done here. For those sorts of occasions, there are organizations that work with landowners to reopen their land to public access and help them manage it and work to manage it with them. For climbing, the Access Fund is a particularly important organization. But it's definitely a challenge, and But there are plenty of landowners who love the land they live on and want to share that and have trails that they want to share with other people, and are happy to share that. So it's wonderful.
I think we have time for one more question. It's you.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, boy. Make it a good one. Can you tell us a little bit about Monadnock Trails Week?
There we go.
No.
I was getting
Did he
to
do it?
that.
Oh, he
Yes.
did? Oh, no.
I was going to plug that, and I almost plugged it in the last, like the question before last, but I didn't. So every year, the Forest Society, which owns a considerable portion of Mount Monadnock, we lease it to the state to run as and manage as Monadnock State Park, but we still have our hand a little bit in the management. And so every year we hold an event called Monadnock Trails Week, and it is an opportunity for volunteers to come out and a 5-day event for them to come out and work on trails with us. And so this year, that I'm pretty sure these dates aren't 100% set in stone, but should be September 4th through 8th. And we invite anyone of all sorts of ability to come out and volunteer on the trails with us and give back to that trail, those trails that we love to hike on. And just to spend a good time in the woods, because as hard and difficult as it is, trail work is also, I think, a lot of fun. So it would be awesome for folks to show up for that, and that'll be happening this fall.
Great. Dewey, yes.
Yeah, Dylan, I know you forgot the materials.
Oh,
But how do people, all right, first of all, are there regular volunteer opportunities in the Forest Society?
I'm thankful for everyone prompting me into all these questions. I have things to communicate about. There are opportunities within the Forest Society. I cannot rattle off a URL off the top of my head that'll bring you right to the volunteer opportunities page, but forestsociety.org is our website, and throughout the summertime, we're hosting, like Trails Week, we host a lot of one-off volunteer events. And those happen all across the state. We're a statewide organization. So we are operating from way down in Hollis all the way up to Pittsburgh. And I guarantee you, wherever you're from, there's an opportunity near you to help volunteer and do good conservation work, whether it's trail building or other stewardship and conservation work. And we definitely have a lot of things in this region. So go to forestsociety.org. There's a volunteer newsletter if you really want to stay connected, you can sign up for it. And we have volunteer opportunities that are posted regularly on our website.
And I'm going to add the plug that they're basically like family.
This is true. We have a lot of really valued and dedicated volunteers who have been with us for decades. And we really value the work they put in, and it's a really fun community to be a part of. Thank you, Dewey. Dewey is absolutely a valued member of our volunteer community.
Excellent, great. Thank you so much, Dylan. Thanks for the work you do. And hopefully we'll see you all next month on the 27th to pancakes, tasting the syrup. Here's some good stories. So thanks for coming out.